Hello there. The great factions and powers of the entire Milky Way galaxy often come to blows. They all have differing political agendas, differing purposes to their existence, and vastly different histories. It's actually surprising, with the sheer age and vastness of the galaxy, that many of these powers don't come to blows more often. And quite frankly, with some of the differing ages of the races, we put humanity in perspective. By the time of the Dominion War, for example, the human race had only been spacefaring on one level or another for about 400 years. And that's being very generous to say that when we launched the first man-made object of any description into space, as in the V2 rocket, we count that as we became officially a spacefaring civilization. Or maybe you want to call it from when we first put a person in space or an animal in space. Whatever, it's about 400 years. But there are other powers that prowl the galaxy far older and more advanced and more dangerous than humanity and the Federation. Of course, humans have unnaturally moved quickly. This was observed by the Vulcans, who noted that within the span of 100 years, humans had broken the Warp 2 barrier, colonized systems beyond their own. They had encountered multiple new civilizations and were already poking their noses in things that took the Vulcans more than 2 centuries to accomplish. It was well over 200 years before the Vulcans broke the Warp 2 barrier, and it was even longer before they really started to venture out into deep space. This unnerved the Vulcans, the sheer pace of human development. It's one of the reasons that humans, plus the Federation overall, were able to stand toe-to-toe with a power like the Dominion, that, depending on which source you want to believe, is either 10,000 years old or 2,000 years old. It varies. I suppose you can define it again by when they first started something, maybe when the changelings first went out, versus maybe when the Jem'Hadar were developed. Who knows? But there are other powers, such as the Borg, for example, have been around much longer, possibly. There are many theories about these powers, but we're going to have a hypothetical today. What happens, we take the Federation out of the equation, and we have a little fun. The Borg versus the Dominion. How would these two powers stack up against each other? They're both incredibly belligerent, but unlike when the Dominion encountered the Alpha Quadrant powers, the Borg are already vastly overpowered, incredibly advanced, and are a bit different in their approach to things. So, we've got to put things on a table. Let's assume that this hypothetical little incursion is taking place around the time of the Dominion War, but there is no Dominion War, so the Dominion isn't distracted fighting the Romulans, the Klingons, and the Federation. The Cardassians, and let's say, the Breen, are all part of the Dominion. Okay? The Dominion at the absolute height of its power, but minus the war. The Borg, around the same time period, also more or less at the height of their power, before they got infected with the virus that would break them down, and other such things. And yeah, they may be weakened a bit from the conflict with Species 8472, but this is the Borg. So, how does the theoretical conflict between the Borg and the Dominion take place? Now let's have a quick look at the assets that both factions have at their disposal. Both are, as far as we know, the major, or at least one of the major factions of their respective quadrants of the galaxy. The Gamma for the Dominion and the Delta for the Borg. The Borg are of course more omnipresent, they're everywhere. Hell, they transcend, most likely, this realm, this particular galaxy. But we know for a fact the Borg are spread across all 4 quadrants. But in disposition forces, let's start with the Dominion. The Dominion is made up of multiple different races, kind of like the Borg, all working together, unwillingly, also kind of like the Borg, for the greater glory of the Founders and the security of the Dominion. But that gives them a lot of resources and a lot of assets. It does mean, unlike the Borg, though, they're trying to suppress many of those civilizations, but that's probably not a big issue for the context of this particular versus. The Dominion's primary assets are the Jem'Hadar, who are its fighters, the Vorta are its negotiators and administrators, and the Changelings, who are the leaders. And let's face it, probably pretty unassimilatable by the Borg, but the Jem'Hadar and the Vorta, I can't see any reason they can't be assimilated. The Dominion spans a huge region of space, and by now has also spread itself into the Alpha Quadrant and absorbed more powers from there. From these different respective races, it gains military technology, assets, intelligence, and manpower. We can assume that they have similar relations with some of the races in the Gamma Quadrant that they have to the Cardassians and the Breen, and that they will have them fighting for them, have them working with them, or at least supporting the war effort in one form or another. as well as the races they're of course trying to suppress. The Borg, however, are at least as old, probably, as the Dominion. Technologically, I would say on a par, but in some areas probably more advanced, in other areas less advanced. But that's a gap, considering how the Borg fight, that would close very quickly. I think in the areas that count, the Borg have a lot of advantages. The Borg are again a collection of different races that have been assimilated together forcibly to work together in harmony in their version of perfection. The way they attack, though, is different to that of the Dominion. The Dominion typically sends in the Jem'Hadar, controlled by the Vorta and coordinated by changeling infiltrators and other operatives. However, even including the other assets, Cardassians and the Breen, the Dominion fights more conventionally, whereas the Borg are extremely unconventional in their warfare. They fight more asymmetrically. Now, the Dominion will hit you head on, which is what I'm going to assume they're going to have to do in the scope of this conflict. Because fighting the Borg, it's not going to be a war of subterfuge. The Dominion's also going to not be able to use some of its bag of tricks. For example, changeling infiltrators are not going to be a thing. They're not going to be able to infiltrate the Borg. Maybe they can sneak aboard Borg cubes, hide away, sabotage and things of that nature, but the Borg are going to get wise to that pretty damn fast and will adapt to it. They'll learn how to detect changelings. A changeling masquerading as a drone would be detected instantly, so they'd have to masquerade as something else. That would all be easily overcome by the Borg. They'd also likely either would have assimilated technology or would have simply been able to, on some level, even though they don't tend to analyze and study, they would have been able to analyze the changeling's ability to shapeshift, the general matrix of it, and develop a countermeasure to it. They would adapt. So I think that the changeling's ability to infiltrate will be limited. So, let's get straight into it. How do these two powers stack up if they were to go to war? So we're going to assume the Borg, in their typical tactics, which are not like those of the Dominion, whose intent is to conquer and control, the Borg's purpose is to improve themselves, which does not necessarily mean the total subjugation and assimilation of an entire race. There is a theory, one I personally do subscribe to, that the Borg farm the galaxy. They do assimilate whole civilizations on occasion, probably to increase their number, but where we see them, how they deal with race like Species 116 or Species 8472 or humanity is very different. 8472 they're in a total war with, but it's mostly on the back footing. It's a defensive war. Species 116 they really wanted, for whatever reason, to assimilate that race, more than just their technology. They wanted the entire species. Maybe they were a persistent threat like 8472, or maybe it was because they considered that they'd farmed them enough. Humans, however, they send a single vessel, hundreds of cubes, thousands of cubes to deal with 8472 and 116, but humans, one ship at a time. It's a very strange option. They have the ability to send a dozen, 2 dozen, 100 dozen cubes to Earth if they really had a mind to, but they don't. So we're going to have to assume that with the Dominion, they've been farming them. The Dominion's been responding to the Borg's incursions by getting more aggressive and using suicide tactics and basically ripping off Borg tech to try and adapt to it. The Dominion's known to be very resourceful, but so far they've not demonstrated the ability to have any kind of transwarp capability. And we're not going to give it to them because the outset of this war they haven't had that opportunity to do it, but they have had the opportunity to study some Borg technology, and they've studied their tactics. The Borg start off with a typical way. They send in a single ship. It begins assimilating odd worlds and ships that it encounters around the Gamma Quadrant. And this results in a response in the Dominion wondering what's happening, much like the Federation and Romulans did when colonies were attacked on the neutral zone. So the Dominion's response is to send in the Jem'Hadar and the Vorta to investigate. They eventually encounter a cube. This battle does not go the way the Dominion wants it to. The entire ship or squadron of ships are assimilated or destroyed by the cube. This may have been the Borg's first encounter with the Jem'Hadar and the Vorta, and from this they learn they've got some choice technology and abilities, and the Jem'Hadar make excellent tactical drones. So they want more of that Dominion action, so they start to farm them. But they use the same tactic they do with the Federation, because in the Dominion you see something similar to the Federation, a collection of races working together to common goal. Not in the same way, but superficially kinda similar, so they begin to treat it kinda similar. The Dominion, however, realizes that the Borg represent one of the greatest threats to their existence imaginable. The Changelings realize that the Borg will likely designate them a threat and eliminate them. but the Jem'Hadar and the Vorta will be assimilated, the Dominion will collapse. And either way, the Changelings are not in for a good time in this conflict. So they begin to order the construction of more larger, more heavily armed ships, a better early warning system, and ability to track. They start to learn how to track the Borg ships while still in transwarp conduits. They likely would send out ships, they would learn as much from other races who've encountered the Borg as they could, they'd learn about transwarp hubs, and they'd begin to try to capitalize on any technology they can get their hands on in order to try to counter the Borg threat. The Borg, however, assimilating them and others, would quickly realize that this is what the Dominion was doing. At first, this is good. This means more technology, more stuff they can assimilate and make part of themselves to make themselves better. So the Borg send in more ships. They start sending in spheres and probe ships, the odd cube, still farming, still hitting. But eventually, like with the Federation, they realize they've got to hit it a bit harder. So they send a cube in to try to hit a major planet within the Dominion. Probably not a homeworld of some race, because the Dominion might just let that fall. So they go for a shipyard. But they encounter much stiffer resistance than expected. Whereas with the Federation, such as the Battle of Wolf 359, they eliminate and knock out many ships. The Dominion don't really keep older ships around. These are all state-of-the-art, perfect warships that engage the cube, eradicate the cube, and actually take relatively light casualties. Suddenly the Borg realize that the Dominion has adapted to their technology. So, now, learning their lessons, the Borg send in more ships like the Class 4 Tactical Cube. And they'll start sending in more spheres, which keep the Dominion off balance and separate out their forces. They start to hit the resource worlds. Now they realize the Dominion potential could be a threat. The Borg analysis of the problem is that the Dominion might develop technology such as transwarp, as they're getting awfully close to the transwarp hub, which, if that was to fall, could mean that Borg space at its core was threatened by the Dominion. The Borg start assimilating the Dominion everywhere they can, but they realize the Dominion is breeding Jem'Hadar just as fast, if not faster, than the Borg can assimilate them. In some ways, this is a good thing. The Borg are increasing in number, but they've got to counter this with more ships, more resources, weakening their core territory by sending more vessels to the Gamma Quadrant. Now, the Dominion is trying to find a way to reach the Borg at their core, but for the most part, their main goal is to try to make any kind of attack upon themselves by the Borg so costly to the Borg that the Borg won't want to keep doing it, because ultimately that's going to damage perfection. But like with species 116 and species 8472, the Borg are more disinterested in casualties than the Dominion realizes. They don't care. You can kill millions of drones in the blink of an eye, blink them out of existence, they don't care. They just don't care. They'll just keep assimilating the Jem'Hadar. The Borg are also stepping up their campaigns across the galaxy to increase their number, assimilating more humans, more Romulans, more Vulcans, more Andorians, Denobulans, even Kazon or other races, just purely to increase their number, to increase the amount of cannon fodder they can throw against the Dominion. And as a result of this, without an ability to attack the Borg at their core territory, the Dominion is at a huge disadvantage. It becomes a war of attrition, and yes, the Dominion is able to inflict huge casualties on the Dominion, but thanks to suicide tactics, they're able to destroy a lot of Borg ships. But as the Borg increase their armor and increase their mobility, this becomes a strain. The Borg learn to concentrate their attacks on key facilities within the Dominion, preventing the Dominion slowly from being able to increase its number like it had done. In a war of attrition, my conclusion is the Borg have every advantage. Mobility, strength, technology, and every adaptation the Dominion makes to fight them, the Borg are able to counter it. Now, the Dominion will have many successes. Just like the Federation and the other races, they will learn weaknesses within the hive mind. They'll learn to exploit certain problems that the Borg have with studying new technology without the ability to assimilate it. Jem'Hadar will commit suicide before being assimilated. Assimilating a corpse is a little more difficult, especially if it's been vaporized. The Borg learn that assimilating the Dominion is a monumentally difficult task, but also allowing it to continue to exist would be a long-term detriment to the collective, as the Dominion will do nothing but get stronger. And at first, that seems good, again with the whole farming thing, but now it's a direct threat. It must be eliminated. And unfortunately, despite all the adaptations and intelligence the Dominion often shows in its ability to deal with any power that it comes up against, I think that dealing with a race like the Borg, who are hell-bent, and I mean determined to beat you in an all-out war, unless your technology is completely impervious to their assimilation, which there's nothing about Dominion tech that states that this would not be the case, that they would be perfectly well able to assimilate them. And even if they can't assimilate Jem'Hadar because they're so perfectly engineered, it's not the same thing for the Vorta. It's probably the same thing for the Changelings. The Borg would eventually break through the Dominion's defences, they'd wear them down, and unless a third party entered the war on the Dominion's half, such as 8472, 116, even the Federation and the other powers, the Dominion would be cut off from its Alpha Quadrant resources. The Borg would simply collapse the wormhole. And even if they considered that a minor threat, with their isolation, the Cardassians and the Breen would likely be abandoned by the Dominion to retreat back to the Gamma Quadrant to protect their core territories. Once abandoned, they would either be ignored by the Borg, or potentially the Borg may have considered the Dominion being spread into the Alpha Quadrant was too great of a risk and would have assimilated any assets that it had. A dozen or so cubes invading Cardassia, you can say bye-bye to the Cardassians. Same with the Breen. Give them a dozen or so cubes, the Breen are probably being overwhelmed. So, back to the Dominion, its forces will break. The Dominion will slowly lose the ability to breed Jem'Hadar as the Borg will target those facilities. They'll learn of their existence through assimilation. Also, Borg technology on many levels is far superior to that of the Dominion if they really turn it into high gear for war, with their general idea that they will create weapons of mass destruction, such as some of the things they created to fight Species 8472. We're talking nanoprobe bombs that would detonate in the atmosphere. They'll just assimilate everything on the planet. Entire cloning facilities, Jem'Hadar breeding facilities, Dominion shipyards, these will be the key targets. They'll be overwhelmed, and eventually the Dominion would come up to a point where it could no longer properly defend its assets, and the Borg would simply come to the conclusion that the Tal Shiar and the Obsidian Order had, which, as after assimilating the Cardassians they would have learned about, cutting the head off the snake. So they send 100 cubes and 1,000 spheres and 2 billion drones to just wipe out the Founders. Yeah, they might lose 50 ships, 100 ships, 200 ships, 1,000 ships, but they'll do it. They'll break through those defenses, and they will lay waste to the Changelings, and the majority of the Changeling civilization will be destroyed. They'll probably even send a ship to assimilate Deep Space Nine so they can get rid of Odo, because no Changeling can be allowed to exist. And that's how I see this war going. Let me know in the comments section below if you completely disagree and think I'm completely wrong, and that the Dominion would stand a better fighting chance. I think the war would take years, and I think it would be a war of attrition, and I think the Borg would come out of it with the loss of hundreds, if not thousands of ships, and certainly billions of drones. There is wildcard possibilities that the Dominion would manage to gain control of the transwarp hub that exists in the Gamma Quadrant, but we don't know that the transwarp hub is anywhere near Dominion space. It could be thousands of light years from it, and without the ability to reach transwarp, it'll take years to get there. There's the other problem that maybe the Dominion would actually be able to reverse engineer or develop some other kind of transwarp technology, or get one of their subordinate powers to do it. Once got it, they'd be able to reach the Borg and be able to inflict similar damage on the Borg, or even rally support against them in a local region of space, fighting proxy wars against the Borg, limiting their Borg's ability to produce ships and assimilate drones locally that they could then send against the Dominion. Those could be variables that could go in the Dominion's favor, but I don't think the Dominion would have the time to make such massive adaptations to their forces while being besieged by an extremely determined collective hell-bent on their destruction. But let me know in the comments below your thoughts. I really want to know, who do you think comes out on top in this war? Does anything of the Dominion survive? Does it manage to infect the Borg with some kind of virus? Or find some other way to defeat them? Like, share and subscribe, and that is the end of this video.